The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, HR and Payroll Record Retention, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're so happy you can join us. My name is Deb Beto, and I will be your moderator today and be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discuss can be found at the URL currently showing on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. If you have audio difficulties, please try changing the volume level on your device. If a telephone line goes dead during the call, hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Please feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box or questions box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, and then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will try to work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenter will be answering questions throughout the presentation and at the end of the presentation. And lastly, we have a number of webinars upcoming covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we offer the mandatory Preventing Harassment training in English 3 times a year. With that, let's begin today's webinar, HR and Payroll Record Retention. Today's interactive session will be facilitated by CJ Westrick. CJ Westrick is an SPHR and has been in Human Resources Management for over 25 years and received her Senior Professional in Human Resources for SPHR National Certification in 2002. She started HR Jungle in 2006 and targets companies that want senior level HR expertise on a part-time basis. HR Jungle provides business owners and management teams workable solutions and hands-on assistance with employees and legal compliance through outsourced HR services. Welcome, CJ. We're looking forward to today's presentation, HR and Payroll Record Retention.
Thank you very much. And hopefully everybody can hear me all right. And so today we're going to be talking about the laws that require retention, the categories of the types of records you might be keeping, what's inside each category, and the retention timelines. I always like to start off with anything I can find in the news about this type of thing. This is a little bit of an old one here, but Bank of America had a big lawsuit because the company wasn't paying overtime and other wages. And part of this was that they didn't really have it documented well. So they couldn't really back up because if, although the paperwork side of HR sometimes can be boring, it's crucial to most companies as far as being a defense for any kind of claims that you get. So, when you don't have the backup, usually the states or the feds will believe whatever the employee tells them. So Bank of America had a big lawsuit on just the paperwork backing up their time cards and how they were paying people. Then we had this other company, La Fiesta Fresh Mexican Grill and Cantina. This one was in Virginia about sexual harassment. But what happened was there wasn't any policy or complaint procedures in effect. They didn't have a written document, telling people what the rules were for dealing with something like this. And I'll mention too, part of their punishment, shall we say, aside from the money, was that they have to now report to the EEOC for 3 years on how they're doing this stuff. I have noticed the EEOC changing some of the ways they go after companies and forcing new policies and practices and reporting back to them to make sure it's being done. And then we have another one where University of Denver paid $2.66 million and had to do some other things because of pay equity rules. They didn't have anything really, they didn't bother to go through their stuff. And pay equity, there's federal, there's some state laws. And so it really, the paperwork really does matter when it comes to lawsuits. And one thing I've learned over the years is that employees keep records, even if you don't. I don't know how many times I've heard an employee where they've made a complaint and then they're suddenly like, well, I have other ones. I can give you the list I have of exactly what they said to me and what date. So employees have learned to keep track of things too that they're not happy about. They may not tell you about it right away, but I'll tell you what, when they start getting serious, they're going to pull that list out. So it really benefits you, your company, that you have your own records specifying things that have gone on with employees so that you can do something to help the company. We're going to jump right into our first polling question. We've got about 7 of these throughout. Most of them, I think, are in the front half. But
Okay.
Deb?
We'll get there right now. Okay. How many agencies dictate record retention? Is it 3, 5, 8, or more than 8? And these polling questions, like CJ said, there's about 7 of them in here. And we're going to encourage you to vote just to make sure that it stays participatory, because that enhances your experience and makes the whole subject matter much more interesting than if you weren't participating. So I'm going to wait till about 75 to 80% of the people have voted. We're getting some good responses in so far. And just a reminder, the webinar materials will be sent out in an email link after the session today. So if you're looking for them right now, you might not find them on the website. We'll send them out. We'll have them available after the session today, and we'll send out an email when they're available. Okay, we're not getting a whole lot of people voting still, so we'll keep moving along here. CJ, we have 29% say 3, 34% say 5, 5% say 8, and 32% say more than 8.
Okay. There are a lot of agencies out there. Some of them might be state agencies. A lot of them are federal agencies. And so that's why it's so important that you kind of know what you're being up against. Is that, you know, there's the Fair Pay, EEOC, there's OSHA, there's, you know, Title VII, which covers a whole lot of things. There's state labor codes. There's the National Labor Relations Act that brings stuff into it, the ADA. So if you think about it, there's lots of different agencies and divisions of the governments that play a role in this, and a lot of them have their own rules. I know if you were just looking at even like independent contractors, and I have, my company's based in California, and I know there were 7 agencies that had different rules for what they considered an independent contractor. So that's just one aspect of everything that you're working on inside your company. So when you're talking about record retention, everybody's got a piece in there, wants something special from you. And so it's really crucial that you learn not only the federal laws, but what your own state laws might be regarding some of this stuff. So right back into another polling question.
Okay. How many files do you have for each active employee? Do you have one big file, up to 4 files, or 2 files? And we're getting a few people, I understand the voting numbers now, we're getting a few people that say that the system is not allowing them to participate in the polls. If you're using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for that option to appear. And then I've also heard that if you're not using a tablet and you're using a computer, there's a screen that you might need to minimize. And I wish I knew better than that, but I don't see things from your side. So I've just had some feedback from people saying if you minimize a screen, then you can participate in the polling. Not sure why that would work. I've put in a suggestion to go to webinar that this feature might have been disabled on their last upgrade, because we've seen this in the last couple of weeks only. So I apologize for that, and we'll see if we can't get that squared away. But hopefully you'll figure out how to vote. And we actually have quite a few more voters this time than we did that last time. So maybe something in what I just said is working. All right, we have 19% that say one big file, 43% say up to 4 files, and 38% say 2 files.
All right. It kind of depends a little bit on how long you've had the employee and what their issues have been. I mean, most companies start off with 1 file for the employee. However, keep in mind there's different things. Ultimately, you might need 4 technically. And because there's that general file, and that's usually the one when I go in to do an audit somewhere where I've seen everything dumped into it. But you know, nowadays, depending on what state you're in, there might be privacy laws that say you should keep anything medical related in a separate file. And so that could be everything from their insurance enrollment form to all of their workers' comp notes and things like that, anything that mentions their health at all. Then you've got the legal file. Now that one you might not need for a while. I usually build them as I need them for each employee. And but the legal file is if you've ever had to talk with your attorney about something with that employee, and that is confidential information that's strictly, you know, you need to keep it separate to maintain that client attorney privilege. And then the I-9s. You never keep the I-9s in your employee files. The reason for that is that, you know, if they come to look at their I-9s, you're having to hand over the whole employee file as opposed to just the forms. So those are kind of the basics that we'll be going through a little bit here. And but first, yes, we have another polling question.
All right, let me launch that. Are your files confidential? And you're going to select 1. I keep them in a locked file. They're in a locked office, but the file cabinet doesn't lock. Both the office and file cabinet are locked when I'm away, and I don't worry about it much. And I do have some feedback from one of the participants that said that when they hit the escape key, they were able to participate in the polling question. So I hope that helps. We're still getting some votes in, so I'm going to wait here momentarily. All right, so CJ, 35% say that I keep them in a locked file. 12% say they're in a locked office, but the file cabinet doesn't lock. 51% say both the office and file cabinet are locked when I'm away, and just 1% say they don't worry about it much.
All right, I've seen all versions of this. Oops, where'd I go? Let me keep it here for a moment. One thing to keep in mind as far as keeping these confidential, you know, you are held responsible, or I should say the company is held responsible for making sure that no one else can see these files. I've gone into offices where they've got them not even in locked cabinets. They're just sitting there, and it's a main office where everybody's in and out a lot, and they have never bothered to lock them up. I know when I worked inside my company, I would actually we had gotten some new credenzas where I had all the employee files, and our VP of operations discovered as I'm looking at this and I'm asking questions because we got a bunch of new office equipment or furniture at the same time. And what we discovered was they use the same locks on many of these pieces. So if you've got a group of like 4 file cabinets somewhere, it would not be uncommon for them to have the same key. And so we had to go around and make sure, you know, we actually had to get a replacement for mine because there was someone else's credenza that had the same lock on it. And so it's like, pay attention to that. Just because it's locked doesn't mean people can't get into it. And, you know, double check that. Every lock, you know, that you get from someplace has a little number on it. And make sure there aren't any other locks with that number in the building, really. And because you don't want suddenly identity theft is out there so much. You just, frankly, employees have a way of wanting to know all the information about other employees so they can get snoopy. And I would challenge those of you who say that it's not in a locked cabinet, but you lock your office. That tells me if you're really thinking it's confidential, then that tells me you never have someone come in and clean your office. We used to have cleaners come in almost every night walking through, and I watched them because often I'd be working late, and they would unlock all the doors and then walk around cleaning each office as they went, and then hopefully they locked the offices back up before they left that night. But for the most part, the whole time they're there, someone else could have come in and looked in your files. So think twice about just how confidential those are. I actually got in the habit of locking both the file and my door even when I'd go out for lunch. You know, I've seen some people who say it should be like as soon in the moment you leave your office. So sometimes I would just keep the file locked all the time except when I needed to be in it. That way I didn't have to worry so much about thinking that it was unlocked when I went to a meeting in somebody else's office or conference room. So give that some thought about the whole confidentiality and how confidential you really have it. So let's talk about some of the files themselves. Recruiting and hiring. You know, if you're in a hiring mode, and I know right now there's the pandemic going on, and so it may not be, it's more like a rehiring type of thing going on at the moment, getting people back on the job and stuff like that. But overall, know what your laws are in your state, and what you have to keep and what you don't. Because there is a difference between when you're running an ad and you get resumes versus people randomly just sending you their resume. You know, and do you do job applications? Because that's got a lot of confidential information on it. And, you know, and I know at least in California, we're having to take things off the application that we can't have on there anymore, like date of birth, you know, criminal record, things like that. So make sure you're looking through the paperwork at the same time as you're retaining it, that you don't have an out-of-date document that you're using. But, you know, things that go in with the concept of recruiting and hiring are some, you know, some people still have recommendation letters they've gotten from, whether it might be school if they're just kind of fresh out of college, but it might be from a boss or somebody who is no longer in their old company. You've got the ad. You want to keep a copy of the ads that you've run, because if you ever get a claim on discrimination or something like that, what you put in the ad can play a huge role, and to help defend the company that you didn't put something in there that looked discriminatory. And because if somebody's going to file a claim based on what you put in there, they're keeping a copy of it. So you definitely want to keep copies with each thing you're, you know, each time you're running ads. If you're doing any kind of pre-employment testing, you want to keep copies of what you've done and the results from each, you know, each candidate. Anything that you've got for notes regarding your training or promotion or overtime rules, stuff like that, you need to, again, document these things. And, you know, when I say document, keep in mind, these days, it's not necessary that you keep all the paper. It is necessary that you keep the information. So figure out a system that works for you that isn't going to get lost because you changed online services, something like that. You know, any job openings you sent to agencies or labor unions, things like that, and the salary information. Are you tracking how you're getting information on what is market value for this position? And, you know, the pay rates, what were the market factors, what kind of job classifications? And offer letters. I prefer personally to use a really simple offer letter that doesn't go into a lot of detail other than just start date, how much they're making, my at-will statement, things like that, because I'd rather have separate documents for things about, you know, our benefits, or because they'll change. The same goes if they're on a commission plan. I want to have that as a separate document. Job descriptions should get updated all the time. I want those as separate documents, because I don't want someone to come back to me 2 years later and say, oh, my offer letter says I get this, and now you're telling me something different. And that happens a lot because they consider that offer letter like a contract. That's why I keep it really simple. Then, you know, and again, it goes with the terms and conditions of employment. I've seen some people using what they're calling it an actual employment agreement, 8-10 pages long with all these details about their employment. And I don't like doing that because, again, I'm looking at what the paperwork says. And I've seen too many times where that changes from person to person, so you don't have the constant going on. And with HR, consistency is huge for defending a company. And so I'd rather have an employee handbook that lays it out so that I know everybody's looking at the same information. When you do background checks, are you keeping all of that stuff confidential? Again, you know, it's like a manager often has the right to see what's in an employee's file. But there are some things that they don't need to see in order to do their job. A manager, you know, background checks, you know, credit reports are much harder to do these days. A lot of times criminal background checks, depending on what state you're in, that is changing on how you have to go about it. I know in California, you now have to have a written offer of employment before you can do the background check. And so you make the offer, it's contingent. It says it's contingent on the results of the background checks. But it also means, and then we're going to have to be very careful about what we're saying we're using to not hire them, if that's the decision. And we're more limited with that option too. But any of this stuff, really most of the attorneys and stuff say that HR should be seeing this stuff, and then they tuck it away and they merely tell the hiring manager, yes, it's fine to hire that person or not. You don't pass around what you're seeing on the credit reports, on the criminal background checks, any of that, because those people don't need to see it. So keep in mind, some of this stuff is on a need-to-know basis. And when you look at these things, you want to keep that in mind, that they don't need to see that, because if they see it, it might be bugging them in the back of their mind where they've been now feeling forced to hire them. And somewhere in there, it's going to start showing up under discriminatory practices that they do, or actions they take, or biases that they show. So you want to pay attention. Not only are you holding onto the record, but often you're holding onto that information. And we go into another polling question.
All right, I'm going to launch the poll. How long do you need to keep recruitment and hiring records? 3 years, 5 years, or 3 years after termination? And while you're answering that polling question, CJ, I will say there was at least a dozen questions regarding electronic records, because your scenario in our last polling question assumed that they were all paper records and there was no option for electronic records. So what is...
Most of the courts now are... most of the courts now are allowing the digital. There's times when, and I think it's more like a question with an attorney or something, like if you need to keep what they call the wet signature, the actual signature, the live signature on a piece of paper. Sometimes they'll do that with like a non-disclosure agreement. And but everything else now is something you can digitize. And it's more important that you've got a copy of the record somewhere than you've got the actual paper, but do make sure. One thing that the courts have said is you want to make sure that if you're using the digital and having people sign off on important documents digitally, that you need to make sure that you've, like I'll use DocuSign a lot, and it's passed, it's been tested in court. So that's why I will trust that. But mainly they want to make sure that no one else could have gotten into that document and signed it for the person, because a lot of times it's just printing out the name is the digital signature. And so you want to make sure that if they're just using, all they have to do is put their name on there and it's going to their home computer. I mean, their spouse could have done it, a child could have done it. So that's the biggest thing with the digital records, is that they are secure and that you're making sure that there's some kind of an authorization mode in that system that makes sure that this is the person who signed it, that they had to provide their social or something. So that's usually the big thing you want to watch for, that it's not just that you scan these papers. I mean, you can just scan the documents that they filled out on paper and then keep those, because those, you had the signed in, it's their actual signature. But if you're doing digital signatures, make sure it's coming through a resource that you has been tested in court.
Okay. And our polling question answers are 15% say 3 years, 13% say 5 years, and 72% say 3 years after termination.
All right. Technically, it's 3 years. However, that's just what the law kind of says. And it's 3 years if you didn't hire the person, and 3 years after termination if you did hire them. I've actually had attorneys tell me that, particularly now that you can scan stuff, you should hold them for the life of the company. And because some litigation comes in very long, I mean, look at some of the things that, people after they've been fired, shall we say, file a claim, and they may have a 3-year time frame to even file the claim. So if you're in there trashing those records at 3 years on the dot, you might suddenly have found you trashed the records that needed to be used for defending that claim. So I would say my normal, like I said, this is the legal, my normal recommendation is that after, if you're keeping paper, then after 3 years of from termination, now you scan them, but you keep them all, and you find a place, that, again, a secure online resource that you can, pay, I don't know. I mean, and when I say secure, I'm not talking Dropbox. I'm not talking like Box. Look at some of these that you truly need, because I know I've worked with clients who won't let me send them stuff through Dropbox because they have determined that it's not secure enough. And like the one that particularly got, like really anxious about it is someone who works with the Department of Defense. And so, it's like, think about that, is that these, again, are, confidential records. You don't want anybody accessing them other than those that should be. So research, your sources for being able to store something. But at least then you don't have all that paper sitting around, because I've seen boxes and boxes. And ironically, those boxes end up getting stuck in a warehouse somewhere and, with tape around them. Not secure. I mean, anybody, if you're not back there checking them once a week, anybody can go back there, slice open the tape, and take a look at what's in there. So, think about, where you're storing that old information and, and what it's doing. But I am a big believer these days on just scanning the stuff when you would otherwise trash it and then put it in a secure place online somewhere where, whether it's a drive you've got that secure and backed up, something like that. You are not required to keep unsolicited resumes. So that's why I was saying with the recruitment process, if you're running an ad, those are considered solicited resumes that you've asked people to send in a resume. Those you're required to keep. And at least for 3 years if you don't hire them. If they just, like I said, randomly are sending it in, then you aren't required to keep those. But if you have a HR page on your website that shows here's our openings, those would be considered solicited. So because you're asking people, the fact that you've put it out there publicly, oh, we've got these positions open, then that means you're asking for resumes. So, keep in mind what is the solicited versus unsolicited. And if you can't tell the difference, then keep them, for 3 years. So the other thing as we go through this whole webinar is to keep in mind is if there's ever an overlap, and if you look at an employee's personnel file, there is going to be overlap between one retention period and another. So you are required to keep it for the longest period to make sure that you've, covered yourself legally. So I don't think it's worthwhile to pick through an employment file, employee's file to figure out, oh, I can get rid of this now. Oh, I need to hold this for another year. It's like, that's why I think attorneys tell you, it's like, you know what, scan it and just hold on to it forever. Because some of these lawsuits drag on for a long period of time, and, or now they're extending dates of how long people have, particularly when it comes to discrimination. There's a lot of states that have extended how long someone can file a lawsuit. So you need to kind of stay on top of that, or at least you'd feel secure if you're just holding on to it. It's time period, your initial time period has, lapsed, and so now we're going to scan it, store it in our confidential online resource or separate drive that, only 2 people have access to, that kind of thing. In the basic personnel files, these are the general files that I was talking about. These are the ones you have to keep for 3 years after termination. So this is going to include like any disciplinary notices, any written documents about promotions and demotions, performance evaluations, any of the paperwork that you've got that led to perhaps a firing or a transfer, layoff, or like lately the rehiring and the recall from a furlough or a layoff. Any training records, you want to keep those. Depending on your type of company, I know like companies that are under FDA regulations, usually those training records are maintained elsewhere under quality control, because they're the ones that FDA will come ask them, for whatever training, because it includes more than perhaps just your onboarding. Testing, stuff that you've done. The job classification, how you determined it was exempt or non-exempt. Terms and conditions of employment, if there's anything special about that. So that's what's kind of in a basic file. And, usually when an employee starts, I see, or even if the company's small, I often see that that's just a manila folder with their name on it. And everything's in there. And, but I like to still organize that. I'll put like all of the hiring stuff on the left and clamp it down, and I'll put all the other stuff chronologically on the right, just so it's easier to find something and to make sure you're not losing documents, because maybe a manager came in and took a look at it and oh, suddenly you've got something missing out of it. So you want to pay attention, that these files are your responsibility and you need to make sure that they're maintained properly. Another polling question.
All right, and we've got some great questions coming in, and I will get to those during the session or after the session. I'm not going to forget your questions if I don't ask it right now. So how long does your payroll provider keep your payroll records or reports if you change providers? Is it 0 years, 3 years, forever, any amount of time at a cost? So while you're answering that, speaking of providers, CJ, we have some of our participants that use a third-party company for onboarding their employees online. And so all of the I-9 information is held by that third-party online company. So a couple of questions there. First of all, if an I-9 audit needed to be done, how would the authorities access that information? And secondly, do you consider that to be a safe storage of I-9 information?
I don't consider that a safe storage. You have a third party, and there's nothing wrong with having the third party, but I've used some of those third party services. And when I went to look at what their onboarding forms were, they had some that were out of date. So like in California, we have the special wage theft document you have to give them, and theirs was out of date. It didn't include the new things that had been added to it. The I-9, I think that you want to at least print out from your third party and have in a separate I-9 folder. I usually like a binder, like keep them alphabetical in a binder, because you want to pull them out when somebody's left. And, again, if you've got an audit, you'd want to be able to hand over that binder of current employees. So kind of look at what it is. Make sure, if they've told you they're doing this, make sure you've actually looked at all the forms they're using and that they're using everything that you should be giving them during an onboarding. Because a lot of times the third parties they're generic. They are often offering these services nationwide, so they're only doing some very basic stuff. And you might want to take a look at that and make sure it's got everything you want in there, and that you can print it out, because these companies, let's face it, companies come and go, especially online companies. So you are the one who is held responsible if they suddenly disappear and you no longer have access to their forms. And so keep that in mind. So it's not necessarily secure there.
How would you go about determining if a particular company, you've already said Dropbox is not trusted. How do we know if Google Drive is trusted, or our online onboarding company? What process can we use to determine if they're trusted sources or not?
You kind of look and see, because ones that are truly, if you start comparing something, because even like Google Drive, which is popular like Dropbox is, but I don't necessarily consider that ideal. I've got a client who's starting to put time cards on that. And, and I told her, it's like, the problem is that when they get into Google Drive, often they have access to a lot of the other stuff in there, or an old time card. Maybe they're in there changing an old time card that you haven't been able to lock in some fashion. So I think it's more a question of looking, and you can often do like Google searches to kind of see, what are some secure sites. I know Amazon offers a storage kind of, we'll call it online facility to do things, and that a lot of people, particularly online marketers who have products they're selling and stuff, and they will keep them stored on Amazon because they can limit how it's used. So I think that's part of it, because if you're not constantly checking to see who's still got access to, those drives or that information, then you're not really doing your due diligence to make sure that it's maintained confidentially. And, I think, like I said, the biggest thing is to make sure you can get the information again back off of it at some point.
All right, so now for our polling questions. We're not getting as many voters as we normally do, so I'm not sure what's happening there, but we have 8% say 0, 44% say 3, 19% say forever, and 29% say they'll keep it for any amount of time at a cost.
Yeah, and and it's funny because I help a couple of clients with some payroll, and so I've actually got access to several different payroll systems through clients. And I've got one company that was working with a payroll company where I have the access. And she had decided when she was moving to a different payroll company that she didn't need to have further access to them. And yet, in the 3 months since that's happened, I've had twice now where I've had to go in and dig up some old records for her. Like right now, everybody's getting all these unemployment claims, and she's now having to ask for these old records to fill in some of the information for the unemployment things, or somebody who's looking to buy a house and suddenly they don't have records from their old pay stubs, things like that. So it is funny. Well, in California, you're legally required to keep payroll records for at least 3 years. Now, when we talk payroll records, it includes a bunch of things. So, when you look at the 3-year thing, I've seen some payroll companies where the moment you move out, you're done. I've got, Wells Fargo used to do payroll, and I've got a client who was moving. We were moving her to another payroll company, and all of a sudden they just shut down everything and flat out said, we've shut it down. There is no access anymore to that information. So we didn't get a copy of her final payroll processing that she last did through that company because they closed it down that same afternoon. And because I went in, I think it was supposed to be like the end of September last year that they were closing it down. Well, they closed it down on like September 28th because I went in on that day and couldn't get in anymore. So instead, we're dealing with some old PDFs that she had, things like that, trying to, respond. And she was going through a workers' comp audit. And they're like, oh, we need this information. And we had some old stuff, but it was in a PDF format. And they're wanting us to now kind of recreate an Excel spreadsheet with that information covering the period they actually wanted instead of them doing that work. So it gets very messy if you don't have access to the records. So some of what the payroll company keeps, actually the only thing the payroll company keeps, are those reports that come out with every time you process payroll. So you really should make sure that, your payroll person, whoever's doing that, is getting those reports. I remember they used to always come out, everybody would get shipped paper, and I'd see, big, and they were always these big binders. I mean, like the wide, 17-inch things, and with that information. And then they finally, now most of the companies, you can get it all digitally. But make sure that they're pulling those records off and storing them again someplace confidential so that you can always go back and look at them. But other records that the payroll company isn't keeping for you are, the information about the wages, the rates, when did they get increases. I've gone into companies and looked in employee files and literally had to go through like years worth of payroll reports to find out when somebody got a pay increase so we could document it, because they weren't keeping any other record of that other than just changing it in payroll. And so you really should have, a process for someone getting a raise and, or a promotion, because that stuff should be documented in the employee file in some fashion. The time cards are another one. It's like attorneys love to get those time cards because they're usually looking for problems. Did they, not get paid overtime when they should have, stuff like that. So make sure that those are being saved in some fashion. If you ever get a subpoena on them, you need to produce them. Again, what the individuals' hours and days that they're supposed to be working. Now, you might just have a regular office environment of like 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. So that doesn't really require that. But if you've got special things like, oh, now you've started a second shift, or, and actually I've got several clients who are starting extra shifts right now because of the pandemic in order to have fewer people in the office at the same time. So they're like juggling people and shifts around. Document that. Same thing, employee agreements or any contracts that they've ever had to sign. I've worked in an FDA environment before where we had patents, from like 1,000 different countries, and we had to have employees that were involved in the process signing off on that. Now, normally those aren't going to be kept in the employee files, but if you're involved in that process, make sure that those are being kept somewhere, again, confidential and secure. If you're doing piece rate where you're paying, instead of just an hourly wage, you're paying like on a production basis, that kind of thing needs to be well documented. Everything, ideally these days, because of all the pay equity laws that are coming up out there, you really should have records that explain any wage differentials between the sexes or between departments. They've said that now it's not that, okay, this male, use HR, just an example, a male HR manager, and now you've hired a female HR manager because you've grown, and so you've got two. Now it's not just the basis of, okay, are they paid basically the same, so that you can't show, that the female is paid less than the male, which has historically been the issue. Now a lot of these states are also putting laws in place to say, well, not only that, but if you look at the basic requirements of that position, you might have other managers in other departments with those same basic requirements, not the departmental knowledge and skills, but the, length of employment, or length of experience, things like that. And now they're saying you want to be able to look over the organization and make sure that you're still in the same, you've got them aligned, basically. Make sure that you've got something that documents your wage calculations for straight time versus overtime. And, shift schedules. There's no reason those can't be scanned and maintained if there's ever an argument about when someone was supposed to work. And then, of course, the pay stubs. Those, are the things you get employees asking for, even with the ones that are on the service payroll. They seem to ask for him a lot, because that's like the number one thing employees ask for, because they're trying to buy a house, or they're trying to do this or that. They're getting a credit check, and now you get a question about, pay stubs, and because they didn't hold on to theirs. And, so kind of pay attention to what's included in the whole wage statement concept of what you should be holding on to. The payroll records themselves, you need to hold on to for 4 years. So that's those documents, the payroll reports that you're getting. And because those will have a lot of information in there. One thing I've learned is that there's some payroll companies that will let you, as someone mentioned in the polling question, hold on, pay an annual fee to keep those records out there forever. And but most companies don't want to pay that, or they'll just kind of finally say somebody new will come in, you get a new CFO or controller, and they're like, oh, we don't need those old ones, and they'll cut that off without realizing the other effects that it might have. So pay attention to where that is, and that people who have access to doing something with it know that there's a reason to hold on to those. And but it shouldn't, because your pay records it's kind of like the report that shows everything that's on a pay stub, but for everybody that got processed at payroll and stuff. So take a look at that and recognize, nowadays that we can get it digitally, it's way easier to hold on to it, because I would see just rooms filled with these huge binders, 20 years ago. And so now it's like, okay, you just, again, have a confidential, secure place that you can store those records so that they are accessible when needed. This is like a one-time only slide that I've got in here this year because of the pandemic. Payroll Protection Program, the PPP, is, most companies that I've talked with had applied for it and gotten money from that. But keep in mind that there is some record keeping on your side if you're doing the HR. One thing that's come out of it is because of the federal extra $600 on the unemployment that a lot of states have allowed to go through to the employee, the amount people are earning on unemployment has been a detriment to trying to rehire them or get them back to work. And so some of the things that have come out said, well, if you do a written offer of reemployment, then also if the employee turns down the work and you've kept detailed records of both the offer and their response, it can help your company in still getting some of that loan forgiven. So, but even without that, you still want a record of it, because if they've turned down the work, I view that now as a resignation, and I'm going to process that accordingly. And technically, they're no longer eligible for unemployment at that point. So you do want to document what's going on right now with those employees, because it does make a huge difference. You might think, oh, I just want to go ahead and get that unemployment, but it is coming off of your company's, little balance in the state unemployment pool. And, and so that means that the rates will go up, and it will cost your company financially to let them stay out there on unemployment when you've offered them the work. So as I said, this is only right now because of the pandemic, and because I've been seeing a lot of problems with it. So make sure you're documenting your efforts to get employees back to work, and, or why they're not wanting to come back or not able to come back. And another polling question.
Okay. Do you keep workers' comp claims in the employee file? Yes or no? While you're answering that, I can tell by the questions that are coming in that we're probably going to be online afterwards to make sure that some questions are answered. Here's
All
a
right.
specific question. Um, you had mentioned earlier on about how long to keep documents after termination. What if an employee continues to stay participating in the 401k plan after the termination? Does that lengthen the length of time that you need to keep their employment documentation?
It not so much the employment documentation, because yes, they can stay on that 401k plan as long as you have it open. I usually, you can't force them to move it out, but I really work hard to convince them they should, mostly. And my biggest argument for that is the fact that what I've seen is when someone stays in an old employer's 401k for a long time after they've left, is that eventually you stop getting those address changes. And you're responsible for making sure that they're hearing about things that are going on with the 401k, sending them the annual summaries, things like that. And so I think that's what I use a lot to try and convince them to roll it out to an IRA, or as soon as they've got new employment where they can get into the 401k, they roll it over to that one. Mostly because it ends up being like forgotten money that sits out there, and it's costing your company for them to be in your plan. But keep in mind, you can't force them out. All you can do is convince them that it's probably a better idea so that they've got their money more consolidated in, location.
Right. Okay, so for our polling question, we have 26% say yes and 73% say no.
Huh. And so I mentioned earlier on that the workers' comp goes under the medical. So what I used to do when I worked inside, I'd have those big folders with their, the big employment file. And then I would actually stick another manila folder inside of it where I would keep their medical documentation, or one that was labeled legal. And that way, if I ever needed to give that main folder to someone, I could easily just pull that out, because no one else needs to see that. If manager says, hey, I'd like to take a look at Sam's employment file. Okay, sure. You pull out the file, pull out those little inserted manila folders that had the medical or the legal information in it, hold on to those, hand them the file to look at. So that's one reason you want to do that, because medical privacy has become much, much bigger in more recent years, to make sure that you're not spreading out information or giving them. And a workers' comp could have everything from a note from a doctor that now lets that manager know that, oh, this person has cancer or something like that. It's not affecting their job yet, but oh gosh, maybe I should start like working my way to clearing them out of the company. So you need to kind of make sure that the manager isn't given information that to just automatically develop a bias without even thinking about it. And I think, I've seen employees that get upset thinking that the company has divulged information about something that was wrong with them while they were out on a long leave. And, and again, if you know that medical information is kept in a separate file that nobody else is seeing, you can defend that claim. But you can't if it's all bundled together. And I know it used to be bundled together. That's why I'm saying that more recent, in the last few years, the personal privacy stuff has gotten much more play in the news, in the laws, things like that. So I think it's just better to make sure you keep that separate. So overall employee benefits, that too kind of all ends up in the medical folder. And it really, does make a difference, because that is kept for like over 6 years. Because some claims on, I've gotten workers' comp claims like a year after someone's left that are saying it's, cumulative trauma. And they're looking back at like the whole length of their employment for this, to kind of see and to do things like that. But the medical stuff can drag on. And, even when you've changed medical, like carriers and things like that, you still want to keep track of all that stuff, because some stuff I've seen where you've changed perhaps workers' comp carriers, and now it's like you're having to talk with the old carrier plus the new carrier. And as someone mentioned with the 401k, if you've got something like that, you need to keep their records indefinitely, the retirement, anything retirement related particularly. So, and that's why I kind of say, sometimes if you can just scan the stuff, it's better to hold on to it forever in a secure location, because you just don't know what's going to pop up, and that may need that document or that information. Insurance applications, American Disabilities Act, and their subsequent laws that they passed regarding that. The medical records, say the ADA is saying you should keep them separate. So then you want to, do something like that. That's why I kind of say, look at the health insurance. Nowadays, if you're doing group insurance, they're not really asking medical questions, but perhaps you're offering a life insurance that now, if the employee wants to get higher level, because I think it's over 50,000 of life insurance that, a lot of times that you might extend that number for your management or something, and they need to have a health questionnaire filled out. That needs to be kept as confidential information. The workers' comp claims, because they're usually going to have doctor's notes or comments written on there about the health of the employee. So anything that talks at all about their health in any way, you might want to just keep separate and save yourself the hassle of worrying about whether or not it is something different. And FMLA, Federal Family Medical Leave Act. If you've got 50 or more employees, you are subject to this. So you want to make sure that you've kept your policies and what the benefits were. You want to keep track of the dates and hours of the leave that they've taken. I've got this monster spreadsheet that my company uses because we do the FMLA for about 6 of our clients. And so we keep, very good records on exactly what's going on and how much they've used, things like that. And because you want to have those records if there's a dispute about the designation of the leave. Depending on what state you're in, there may not be a lot of other options, but in California, it's getting very messy. We have so many leaves available now. They've actually started developing these charts of how these leaves overlap each other. And it can be very confusing to the employee and to the companies trying to use them. So you want to have records that kind of talk about this, because if your state has different types of leaves, maybe, there's FMLA, we've got California Family Rights Act, which can and sometimes overlap FMLA and sometimes it doesn't. Your state may have something similar like that. But anything that relates to the employee's benefits relating to their leave, on whether or not they're maintained while they're on leave or they aren't maintained. Sometimes they'll have a law that says that you must maintain their benefits while on leave. But anything related to FMLA, you want to keep for at least 3 years. And, like I said, there's a lot of reasons why you might want to keep it even longer. And our last polling question.
Okay, let's get that launched. What do you do with records from an internal investigation? Do you keep them in the employee's file, keep them in a separate file, the attorney keeps it all, or trash when the investigation is over? So to get to a question here, if you post jobs electronically, going back to the rules regarding how long to keep information from a job posting. If you post electronically, is that electronic posting good enough, or do you need to kind of keep your own separate records?
No, the electronic posting is good enough, but keep a copy of it, like just print out where it appeared. And so that you can keep, because really where the electronic posting comes up, are you talking for an ad? Or
for an ad.
Okay, for an ad. Yeah, I would, because usually on everywhere you can post it somewhere, they've got then, where you can go look at it. I would then print that out, because it's the language of the ad that will make or break you. And, you want to be able to show this is what it is. If you suddenly are missing like the one ad somebody's complaining about, then that doesn't look good.
Okay.
So you want to save them all, because you just want to have the backup showing here's what was posted. There's nothing discriminatory in here. There's nothing whatever. And, know that you've got the records to back it up.
Okay. So on our poll, we have 21% say keep in the employee's file, 73% say keep in a separate file, 4% say the attorney keeps it all, and 2% trash it when the investigation is over.
All right. So legal claims, it's like if you're doing like an harassment investigation, or you've had it done, or you've got any other kind of claim coming in, you have to save everything, every little piece of document. And now they've taken this, I will say, they've taken this on the federal side to the extent that they're even talking digital records, emails, things like that. You no longer, which I think used to happen, which is why they made the laws, is that it used to be that where somebody would be knowing that this employee's filing claims, that they'd rush out and like go, scan through everybody's emails to make sure there was nothing damaging in there. Now, they've got software that can go track that stuff. And you do not want to be the company that can show that they trashed a bunch of stuff regarding that particular claim, or you're in even bigger problem, bigger trouble. So keep in mind, everything, once you get any kind of claim, you want to hold on to everything in there. I was told by an attorney, it's like, I know some people like to keep it with their attorney, but keep in mind, these people change. That attorney might move on to another practice. It might be that your company changes law firms. So I think it's still always good that you have a record somewhere. I had one attorney that told me that when you get done with the investigation, you put all the stuff in a sealed envelope and put on there a note that confidential, investigation. Don't put much on the envelope, but enough to know that nobody is supposed to open that up unless the attorney tells you you have to go back and look at it. And then again, this is a good place where you've got that little manila file that says legal on it, and you stick it in there so you can pull it out of employee files so that no one else sees it. And but keep in mind that if you're sharing legal claims with other people who aren't part of the claim or your attorney, and you're working with an attorney, you're losing your client attorney privilege by sharing the information with other people. And so be very careful about what you do with that. Then there's all these miscellaneous things, I-9 forms. And, and it's like, again, I pull them from like my binder right away when someone's left, but you're supposed to keep them at least 3 years from hire or 1 year after they terminate. But, and the later, so if you've hired them and they're still working with you, you're still holding on to it because they're an active employee. But do keep them separate. If you do them as an online thing, make sure that you've got like one folder online that has all the I-9 forms, or a physical folder, because you want to be able to pull that information out very easily and quickly if immigration department starts, visiting you. I guess it's Homeland Security now. Some companies hire child labor, which is usually anybody under 18. So you want to keep all that documentation for at least 3 years. Union and employee contracts, at least 3 years, and I would say 3 years from date of expiration. Affirmative action programs are still out there. You need to keep those for at least 5 years. And so when you look at these years, it's not, don't think that, okay, you've got an active employee who's been working with you for 20 years, so you can kind of clean out most of their file. No, most of this is like after the employee has left. And because that's when problems seem to most often pop up. And so take a look at that. But this, because of all this mix of timing, is why, attorneys kind of say, you know what, if you can just digitize it, keep it for as long as possible, because you just don't know when things are going to change or what's going to come up. And even if it's something that can't be used immediately, I have a client who was contacting me about an employee handbook I did for them in 2010. Because they got a claim from someone all this time later that they do catering, and so they take pictures of when they're doing the events and things like that. Well, this employee was filing a complaint that she needed to be paid because her picture was appearing on some of her advertising, and so we had to dig out. We finally found an old copy of the 2010 handbook, which is what this person had signed, and it actually had, which I do put in there automatically now, a permission basically for use of their photo because of the type of business it was in. And so that saved them from that claim. But that's where it pops up in the weirdest places, because no place would you think that you would save a handbook that had been replaced, and updated like 6 different times. But it does come up. So as a final, if it's listed in more than one category as far as a record, keep it for the longest period. digitize most of the records just for ease of storage. You know, you can keep hard copies where the employee's actual signature is legally important, but otherwise you can digitize everything else. Create retention policies. So new people coming in don't know that you don't just go in and clean house and dump all the files. I've actually seen HR people leave and clean out all the files. And it's like, okay, not good. You know, especially their own file, they'll clean it out. So you want some policies in there because you want to make it clear that this is not a good thing to do. And, you know, an attorney, you know, like I said, attorneys recommend keeping the files for the life of the company. So that can go back a long time. And, but if you can now digitize them, and there are companies out there who come in and go through all those paper records and scan them and put them in a digital format for you. So if you've got like tons of them, I've seen a doctor's office where they were closing because the doctor was moving to the other coast and going to work with another practice. And they had a storage unit with boxes and boxes and boxes of old like films, you know, from x-rays and things, and all the employee, you know, not the employee, the client records and stuff. And they ultimately ended up having to have a company come in and digitize it all for them because they needed to hold on to that stuff. But nobody wants to take a huge storage unit with them across country, you know, in a move. So kind of think through what your company does and what is maintained out there, not only by HR, but by other departments. And are they keeping them long enough? You know, so if you've got a safety department or somebody who does safety, look at what OSHA might require for, you know, storage and things. I don't really go too far into the safety side, but you know, use this information to kind of think through every piece of document that's out there that your company does, you know, or has, and whether or not it's important for some reason to keep it longer than they maybe have been keeping it. So that's the end of today's webinar. I'll stay on for a little while if there's more questions, Deb.
And we do have quite a few more questions. So we'll try to get to as many as we can here. So just to clarify, you had mentioned that for the hiring someone, you're supposed to keep records for all the candidates for 3 years. But is that for 3 years after the termination of the person that you hired?
No, that's
Okay.
3 years from date of receipt.
Okay. And is that resumes or just job applications?
And yeah, because I've actually seen, a long time ago, and it's only happened once in all my years. So once I had EDD, which is California's employment division, and they contacted me to confirm someone had applied for a job with us because they had put that on their unemployment form. And so usually with resumes, I keep them kind of in a...
CJ, we lost your audio.
Oh, hold on. I've got, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, geez.
We can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Hold on, it's
Yes.
like I can't decide if my sound just went out or my microphone. Okay.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, now I can hear you.
There
Sorry.
you go. We can hear you. So you were talking about resumes, keeping resumes versus job applications.
Yeah, it's supposed to be, if you didn't, you know, if you solicited the resume, if you didn't, you can throw it away right away. If you solicited the resume, then you're supposed to keep it for 3 years from date of receipt. Okay.
And going, you know, we have quite a few questions about whether or not a specific provider is safe or not. Do you know if T-sheets related to QuickBooks is safe for timekeeping?
I'm familiar, you know, I know I've got a couple clients using T-sheets, but I've not really researched them. And this isn't really my, you know, my forte as far as knowing which are the best ones out there.
Right.
So I think what you do is you go online and you can do reviews of them. You can, you know, because even there's a online site called CNET, cont.com, just CNET,
Mm-hmm.
and they often will do reviews of different software and hardware stuff and things like that. But I've gone in before and looked at them for myself as far as like, all right, they've done reviews of like which, kind of things. But I would also, if you're using a company, quiz them. Go look them up a little bit more, see if they've said something. Like with the digital signatures, you go onto those sites like DocuSign or some of the other ones that have the digital signature, and they talk about the kind of security they've got in the signature itself to make sure that person is the one who's signing for it. So you're looking for similar things, with any of the storage unit things, is to kind of look and see. It's like, all right, with T-Sheets, it's kind of like QuickBooks in the sense, I think on some of those online programs, it's who has access. Now, all your employees have access to go put in their records, but maybe the question I would ask there is, do the employees have access to their old records? Can they, and in a way that they could change them?
Got it.
If it's just,
Good point.
Something like that.
Interesting point. So is it okay if you keep some of the records digitally and some of them in paper form?
Yeah, as long as you've got, I would say, because again, I always think people change, you put them together like that, but if you didn't document how this process works for your department, then somebody else is going to come in and not know where the other records are. So make sure that it's very clean and clear as to how you're doing it.
Okay. And if you have an email exchange with an employee regarding something like a shift change, can you keep that as, just part of your electronic records in your email system, or do you have to store it in a different place, things like that?
Okay, on something like that, it's like I'm not a fan of text messages because I've seen too many of them printed out where I can't tell who that's from. I can see the phone number, but that doesn't tell me who was on the other end of that phone. So I don't like a text message as my backup for something HR related. With emails, I've got my own personal history of I use Outlook, and over the years, 3 times I have lost every email in my database. Microsoft says, a glitch never happened before. Well, it's happened to me more than once, so I'm guessing it happens to other people. Right now, I've been going and cleaning up my email and getting some of those emails stored. I like printing them into a group PDF that I can store elsewhere because I've lost so many old emails that I really would have liked to have kept through just glitches. And so I am cautious about something like, an email system being your sole support of something going on. And frankly, I think if you're doing like a shift change or something that's affecting the employee, I think you want it documented in their employee file, not having to go dig through your emails to find that one email.
Okay. We have about 6 more questions. Do you have time to stay on the line, CJ?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and do it.
We are recording this, so we can send out the recording. If you do have to leave, have other time constraints, and are not able to stay, you can download the recording and get the answers to these questions. So if you use an online portal for all of your benefits administration, and so the employees are doing all of their benefits administration online, including the summary plan descriptions, do you then need to download another copy of their summary plan description to put in their file?
Not normally, because I know I've got clients that are using like Ease and stuff like that lets you do that because we're all very thankful that we're not having to deal with that paper anymore. I don't worry about it so much on that because I assume, from there, it's if need be, we could get copies from the carriers. And so far, it seems to be working because it's not the enrollment forms, if that's all that's being on there, because it's usually not going to have, any other information. And that's what you'd want to worry about is if it was, if you've got an online portal for your workers' comp where every comment was going through that. Now that's fine as long as you're using that carrier. So always think in terms of what happens if we change provider. Does that change anything in our need to keep things? Because and that's usually the biggest thing, because even with various HRIS systems that are storing stuff, that's the one thing I always ask first is how easy is it to get this information off and store it somewhere else? Because things change. There's new technology coming up all the time, and so oh look at that, let's move over to this system. But what do you do with all that old stuff if you can't get it off of it?
Got it. Is there a site that you use for reference to find state-specific information for record retention?
It's, what the site is, it changes with every state as near as I found. You have to kind of go into your state site and just I go to, ca.gov, or, you go to the Texas version or whatever state you're in, and look for employment policies and things like that, because that's usually where they'll find a mention of some retention stuff, or just even, I'm always amazed at how much stuff will come up when I just do a simple Google search, like retention, record retention in Texas, because, and it's somebody in there will talk about it. Often it's maybe law firms that are familiar with like Texas law. And things like that. So, and if you have access to any of the, we'll call it HR subscription sites, they will often mention something too as to what you might need to hold on to. But you have to kind of look for it. I've not found that any state has this as an easy search or similar location, whether it's for posters or for retention, stuff like that. If you're in another state and your company uses a law firm, maybe ask that law firm, because they probably have even faster, better records of looking it up than you can dig out on your own. So kind of use the various resources you can think of, but there isn't any one main one, unfortunately.
Okay. And is it ever necessary to keep old labor law posters to prove that you had one hanging up at a particular point in time?
I've not found it necessary. As soon as I get a new one, I get rid of the old one.
Okay. And then back to PPP. If HR needs to write an offer of reemployment, the question is, should HR write an offer of reemployment, and how does record-keeping offer of work save the employer money?
In the PPP, the thing is, because they finally realized that the feds have kind of made it messy out there when you're trying to hire employees back because of that extra 600 of unemployment. And so they finally realized that, because they started getting a lot of bad feedback on that it made it really hard. Employees didn't want to come back to work because they're making more money out there on unemployment. So what they have said is that, they're constantly like changing and coming up with little clarifications. So what they have said is that if you can show that you made the offer of employment and you can show that the employee turned you down, you can use that because the whole PPP money is based on numbers. They took last year's numbers of a number of employees, how much payroll was, and they're wanting you to kind of duplicate that on June 30th. But in order to have that whole PPP loan forgiven. So what they've said is, if you can show that you've made an offer to get some people back and they wouldn't come back, you can use that to get forgiveness for them, even though you didn't get to use the money on them. Something like that. So that's why you want to have that. The PPP is like a whole nother seminar on its own.
Yes.
But that's the concept, is that it will help you back up forgiveness of the loan, even though, your numbers might have been low to get full forgiveness. This might help give you full forgiveness.
Okay. Regarding long-term record storage, if you use a secure storage company like Iron Mountain, Cora Data, DataSafe, is that sufficient to store files? Do you feel secure with those types of companies?
Again, yeah, they do, because I use like one of those services to just back up my whole computer. I use it. I'm anal about it because, to be honest, because I've had my laptop crash twice over the years, and literally I've taken into places and they're going, oh no, it's a complete meltdown. Nothing can be saved. So I've gotten very, very anal about my backups. I have one of those services that backs up my whole laptop. Because I use Dropbox for, just some like empty forms and things like that. And so I have it completely, back up my whole laptop, all my Dropbox. I even have stuff on SharePoint I have it back up because that's how worried I've gotten about losing stuff. But yeah, those services, I think if you put them somewhere, it depends on whether or not it's a backup service or a storage service. But in the end, I think it's always going to come down to who has access to it.
Right. And
you want to make sure that you've limited it.
I think this question was specific to a storage service, like physical storage.
Yeah, for storage, no, something, oh, physical storage, yeah, something like that can work. And again, just make sure, look at the contract that you've got with them, see what it says about them, responding to somebody, because it may be kind of open-ended that anybody from the company can say, hey, bring me that box, and they will.
Got it.
And, so you want to kind of look at how that's set up to where, it's limited on who can call back some of the stuff that's been put in there. Because it sometimes it's just your warehouse manager that has full access to it. So again, I wouldn't consider that confidential if that's possible. So you might even have two different ones, like one that's your main company one versus one that's your confidential one.
All right, just two more questions. If you are a company that has to keep TB testing records, how if you're required to have your employees retest for TB every 4 years, how long should you keep those records?
I think you're going to want to keep them for a very long time because, that tells me that you're working in a kind of a lab environment or someplace where that's an possibility. And so you want to have, those go in with the medical, I'd be holding on to them for at least 6 years.
Okay.
And
excellent. And our last question, is there any state that you find that's the most strict on retention?
California.
Yeah.
California's got the most employment laws of any place. And so they are going to be the most strict. And since my business is based there, that's why, attorneys are just telling me, it's like, hey, just, put them in a digital format and save them forever.
Right.
Because you just don't know when something's going to come up. And, one of the things, now granted, they can't go back forever, but like in California, if you get a discrimination claim they file with the state, you get this little form letter that has you pulling records, easily for every employee for like 3 years. And every time card, it's like every write-up for all these different people. And it's like, it goes back and back and back. And, but it's like, I'm finding that some of the laws are starting to extend the retention time. So I don't think it pays to try and always cut it off right at that deadline. That's why I think it's easier nowadays to just put them in digital format. And, because you can create some digital things, even a PDF, you copy them all and have them in a PDF, you can put a password on that PDF. And you just want to make sure that, you set it up so that that password is protected and doesn't get lost somewhere. But, there's things like that that you can do on a simpler format as far as saving a digital record that keeps it confidential. And, so you could put it in a drive that maybe your IT person sets up that just, only HR and execs have access to, and then even then you could put a password on the files themselves to help protect them. So that's an option there if you don't want to go looking for an outside storage place somewhere.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send information by email with instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. And thank you, CJ Westrick, for your time and expertise today. We hope all of the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of your time. And be sure to join us on June 16th for Stress Management, Real Tools for Work and Life Balance. Thank you, everyone, and have a safe day.
Thanks, Deb.